6-4 is pulled off. 30 mil inbound!
In this video, we'll be breaking down some extremely intense A-10 Warthog combat footage. We'll be breaking down footage from not just one, but two separate Warthog operations. The footage you're about to see is graphic, and during one of these missions, an A-10 Warthog is hit by an enemy anti-air missile, so viewers' discretion is heavily advised. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, known universally as the Warthog, is without question the most survivable, deadly, and reliable close air support platform ever built. Developed in the 1970s to destroy Soviet armor columns in Europe, the entire aircraft was quite literally built around one gigantic gun, the GAL-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel 30mm cannon that fires 3,900 rounds per minute. And not only does the Avenger cannon shoot Coke bottle-sized bullets, but it's also one of the most accurate air-to-ground weapons ever made, making the Warthog not just the best option, but oftentimes the only option for danger close air support missions.
Here come again!
But the Warthog isn't just deadly, it's also built like a flying tank. Designed with titanium armor to protect the pilot, the A-10 can take quite the beating. It can fly with just one engine and half a wing, which comes in handy in this operation. Born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and raised in San Jose, California, Captain Kim Campbell was always driven by challenge. She attended the U.S. Air Force Academy, graduating in 1997. From the very beginning, she set her sights on the cockpit. She trained at Moody Air Force Base, learning the intricacies of close air support. By 2003, she was flying missions over Iraq with the 75th Fighter Squadron. By early April 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom had moved into its most dangerous phase, the Battle of Baghdad. U.S. forces had pushed deep into Iraqi territory, taking control of much of the countryside. But Baghdad was different. The capital was a maze of high-rises, alleyways, and entrenched Iraqi Republican Guard units. On April 5th, U.S. armored columns had punched into the city center. By the 7th, they were facing organized counterattacks. It was a battle in which air support was critical, but not every jet could fly into the thick of it. F-15s and F-16s flew at high altitude, gunships couldn't always get in. The only aircraft that could stay low, take damage, and keep fighting was the Warthog. And one of those Warthogs, flown by Captain Kim Campbell, was about to make history. On the morning of April 7th, Campbell received her tasking: provide overhead support for advancing U.S. forces south of the Tigris River. It looked like any other standard operation: launch, orbit, respond to calls, but those coordinates, those buildings, would place her squarely in the crosshairs of one of Baghdad's most fortified zones, making this without question the most dangerous mission of her extensive career. The desert sun rose over Al Jaber Air Base in Kuwait, bathing rows of camouflaged A-10s in a dusty gold. It was April 7th, 2003. Inside hardened shelters, crews prepped for a day of missions over Baghdad. For Captain Campbell, it would be her 21st combat mission since the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. It started like any other mission. Campbell reviewed the tasking, loaded the coordinates, and went through the pre-flight. Everything felt routine until it wasn't. While Campbell and her wingman were still en route to a holding point, an urgent request came through. A troops in contact alert had been issued by ground units from the 3rd Infantry Division. They were taking intense fire from entrenched Republic Guard forces in southern Baghdad. The JTAC came over a radio with an urgent tone. Any hog flight on station, this is chaos actual. We are under fire. Multiple RPGs. We need air on target now. Without hesitation, the two A-10s changed course and pushed north toward Baghdad's urban sprawl, where enemy forces had dug in among homes, buildings, and factories. As they approached Baghdad, the environment grew increasingly dangerous. The city's southern sectors were saturated with anti-aircraft artillery, man-portable air defense systems, and mobile SA-7 and SA-14 SAMs. The skies were hostile. Flying in Baghdad was a completely different kind of mission. The A-10s weren't high-flying strike aircraft dropping JDAMs from high altitude. They were down low, right in the thick of the action, and well within range of enemy anti-air weapons. On the ground, the 3rd Infantry Division had become bogged down near an overpass just south of the Tigris River. Bradley IFVs and M1A1 Abrams tanks were advancing through narrow streets when enemy fire erupted from a cluster of warehouses and walled compounds. The JTAC radioed in once again. "Be advised, we are danger close. Enemy firing from a rooftop 200 meters from friendlies, marking with smoke now. Stand by." The JTAC on the ground popped red smoke, trying to mark enemy positions, but winds shifted and the smoke was quickly distorted, making visual confirmation tricky. Campbell's wingman rolled in first, strafing the target buildings with a quick burst. Campbell followed closely behind. She dived from 6,000 feet and lined up her Avenger cannon on the target, a rectangular rooftop with multiple hostiles on top. At just under 1,500 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The 30mm rounds tore through not only the enemy fighters but also the concrete, collapsing parts of the structure. But the enemy wasn't done yet. RPG fire lit up from another direction. Campbell climbed out and circled for a second run. The enemy had split into smaller teams, moving through alleyways, using civilians as shields, and firing from balconies. A second RPG impacted near a US M113 APC, disabling it. The ground troops were now pinned. As the fight dragged on, Campbell's A-10 had already fired 2 full passes. She was starting her third when things began to feel off. The winds had picked up, dust and smoke reduced visibility. The enemy was adapting, shifting firing positions. The radio crackled with a new report. A possible anti-air team was spotted moving near the highway underpass. But the Warthogs had to keep up the pressure. The troops on the ground had nowhere to go, but the Warthogs knew that every run increased their chances of being hit. Regardless, Campbell began her 4th strafing run, this time from a slightly deeper angle, designed to reach deeper into an enemy compound partially hidden behind a factory wall. She armed the gun, called in hot, and began firing. She could hear the power of the Avenger cannon shake the entire aircraft, and then she could see clear impact on target. But just as she started to pull up, a missile slammed into the rear of her aircraft, striking near the vertical stabilizer. The jet rocked violently. Caution lights illuminated across the cockpit. The hydraulic systems failed instantly. The stick became sluggish and the nose dipped. It felt like someone had punched the airplane out of the sky. Campbell grabbed the controls. Nothing responded. The panel lit up like a Christmas tree. An enemy surface-to-air missile had hit her right tail section, shattering hydraulic lines and jamming control surfaces. The jet immediately became unresponsive. Most pilots in this situation would eject, but the A-10 is just built differently, and so is this pilot. Campbell flipped the emergency switch, engaging a backup system called manual reversion. It uses steel cables to move the control surfaces without hydraulic pressure. It feels like trying to fly with a 2-ton weight on the wings. Every movement took massive physical effort. Campbell's wingman quickly called in support and stayed close. Campbell began the long flight back to base, 70 miles south. Every minute in the air was a gamble. The aircraft had lost its tail controls, one engine was failing, and fuel was leaking rapidly. But Campbell kept flying. As Campbell approached the airfield, she knew there would only be one chance to land. The A-10 was barely controllable, especially at low speeds. She came in higher and faster than normal, not knowing if the gear would hold or if the aircraft would roll off the runway. She touched down hard, bouncing once, but stayed upright. The entire right side of her tail was shredded. Holes riddled the fuselage, and the aircraft looked like it had been chewed by giants. But miraculously, Campbell was unharmed. For her actions that day, Captain Kim Campbell was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism and extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. And her story became a case study in courage, aircraft survivability, and pilot skill. She later reflected that staying calm under fire wasn't about being fearless, it was about trusting her training, her aircraft, and her team. You don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on your training. Today, now Colonel Kim Campbell is a speaker, author, and example of leadership under pressure. and her A-10, battered but unbroken, is still a symbol of the A-10 Warthog's resilience. And if you thought Campbell's story was intense, wait until you see the cockpit footage from this next mission. On April 23, 2011, a U.S. Army helicopter crashed in an area swarming with armed hostiles in Kapisa Province, Afghanistan. As soon as the calls about the helicopter crash came over the radio, the 83rd Expeditionary Squadron at Bagram Airfield sent out 2 Air Force Pavehawk helicopters to respond to the crash. Their call signs were Pedro 83 and Pedro 84. Pedro 83 carried 3 pararescuemen, and Pedro 84 carried 2. Upon arrival at the crash site, the Pavehawks immediately started taking fire from the enemy. In the chaos, Pedro 83 somehow spotted one of the pilots who had crawled up onto a ridge about 300 meters uphill from the crash site. And despite small arms fire still slamming into the side of the helicopter, Pedro 83 managed to lower its 3 pararescuemen onto the ridge. Meanwhile, Pedro 84, who was also under heavy fire from the enemy, dropped its 2 pararescuemen, Staff Sergeants Zachary Klein and Bill Senna, as close to the crash site as possible. At the crash site, the 2 PJs found that the pilot had unfortunately passed away, and they started preparing to hoist him out and into their Pavehawk. But unfortunately, the enemy wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. Right after dropping Klein and Senna on the ground, Pedro 84's flight engineer was shot in the leg, and the Pavehawk had to fly back to Bagram to get him medical attention. Enemy fire also forced Pedro 83 to cut its hoist cable and do a daring 1-wheel hover in the combat zone just to get its 3 PJs and the surviving pilot back aboard. And that left Klein and Senna stuck on the ground in the combat zone alone with the fallen pilot. But thankfully, they weren't alone for long, as an AH-64 Apache helicopter arrived on target and started providing air cover.
Alright, you got him? Okay, pushing in here, that's where he's sparkling right here.
Yeah,
there they are, there they are.
Alright, was done.
There, okay.
Yep, engage.
Okay.
Cover fire, we have contact.
Okay, firing.
Where you at? Approaching to 27. Engage.
Keep firing.
Cover 1, 0.
This is 3 Alpha, you're hitting the guys with the RPGs right now.
Okay,
Engage. Engage.
okay, there's one more guy down here.
Okay, 30 millimeters getting shot at.
Keep looking for movement.
Cobra, Slasher 02.
Good range focus.
Are you clear? Can we come in with a pistol?
No, negative, do not shoot, you got friendlies pretty close to where the,
You see where they're shooting at right now, Finesse?
Got movement.
alright, engage.
Engaging.
Cobra, Slasher 02.
Got him.
At this point, the 2 PJs along with the fallen pilot were taking cover behind some big rocks near the crash site when they noticed the fire at the crash site started spreading and getting bigger. Thankfully, Klein spotted a rocket pod that was still full of unexploded rockets attached to the side of the helicopter, and he made the very wise judgment call to get the heck away from the crash site. Thankfully, the Apache overhead was able to give them enough cover fire for them to sprint from the rocks to a nearby ravine, and as they were sprinting away from the crash site, the helicopter exploded. Thankfully, the PJs weren't wounded by the explosion, but bits of molten metal can still be found on Klein's body armor to this day. The PJs were now taking cover in the ravine, but the situation was getting worse. Despite the Apache gunship's best efforts, the enemy was closing in on their position, and the ravine was offering them very little cover. But thankfully, the cavalry was almost there. Captain Rustin Trainham and Captain Mike Hilkert, both of the 74th Expeditionary Rescue Squadron were off supporting other ground forces nearby when a call for help came over the guard frequency. Using the guard frequency is a sacred thing, a last resort, and a true sign that things are really bad and someone needs help now. So as soon as Hilkert and Trainham received the call over the guard frequency from the two PJs, they raced to their location in their A-10 Thunderbolts. As soon as the A-10s arrived on target, they began surveying the area to figure out where the PJs were located and where the enemy was located. At the same time, Hilkert began setting up airspace restrictions and communications relays to the Air Support Operations Center, the Combined Air Operations Center, and Joint Personnel Recovery Center. They also shot rockets into the valley to give Klein and Senna some breathing room, but it didn't last long. Despite the A-10s absolutely hammering the enemy for half an hour, the PJs were now pinned down by close-range heavy machine gun fire. Hilkert's A-10 was running low on fuel, so he hooked up to an aerial refueling tanker that was flying over the target location. And hooking up to a refueling tanker is not an easy task. It requires a ton of skill and focus, but it didn't take Hilkert out of the fight. While he was hooking up to the refueling tanker to get more fuel, he was still marking targets just 50 meters away from Klein and Senna's position. With the enemy's exact danger close location now marked, Hilkert's wingman was able to open up with his 30mm cannons, saving Klein's and Senna's lives. Later that morning, a 32-man Army Quick Reaction Force landed at two locations on the battlefield and was immediately attacked. One soldier was killed and several more were wounded. At this point, Hilkert was in complete control of coordinating all air support in the area. He was marking enemy positions while simultaneously monitoring and marking the locations of one half of the QRF with his binoculars and the other with his targeting pods to ensure that all the aircraft in the area knew exactly where the friendlies were so they could lay down fire on the enemy without risk of hitting friendlies. All in all, Hilkert used 37 different radio frequencies to coordinate 21 aircraft, all while flying his own aircraft and engaging enemy targets. And if that wasn't enough, when a handful of Pavehawks and Apache helicopters eventually moved in to evacuate the wounded Quick Reaction Force soldiers, Hilkert flew his A-10 between the helicopters and the enemy multiple times, drawing all of the enemy's fire onto himself and his aircraft and away from the helicopters. And thanks to his incredibly heroic actions, literally using himself and his aircraft as a shield for his teammates, the helicopters were able to evacuate the wounded soldiers. And at this point in the battle, Hilkert had been in the cockpit of his A-10 for over 10 straight hours. But thankfully, Hilkert didn't have to stay and see this mission all the way through, as Pedro 84 returned to the combat zone to pick up the two pararescuemen and the fallen pilot. But this time, Pedro 84 brought backup. 4 fully loaded A-10 Thunderbolts came in right behind Pedro 84 to replace Hilkert. And with the A-10s completely obliterating what was left of the enemy force, Pedro 84 was able to successfully recover the pararescuemen and the fallen pilot. Overall, Hilkert helped secure 2 landing zones, rescue 2 pararescuemen, recover the fallen pilot, and evacuate 32 QRF soldiers. And for his heroic actions that day, Hilkert was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross.